All right. So, hi, everybody. I just made the mistake of looking at the number of participants. It's great that so many folks are able to join us, and potentially folks that might not ordinarily be able to come to the in-person meetings are able to join us for fun with contracts and data transfer and use agreements. My name is Melissa Korf. I'm the Director for Grants and Contracts at Harvard Medical School. I also co-chair the Contracts Subcommittee along with Alex Albanak and David Mayo, and I co-chair the Data Stewardship Committee. Unfortunately, my federal co-chair, Ricky Queta, recently retired, so that is an open position that you're seeking another federal co-chair for. And then Martha Davis and I together co-chair the Data Transfer and Use Agreement Working Group. Alex and Martha, do you each want to introduce yourselves? Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Alex Albanak. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Research Administration at Johns Hopkins University. I'm also the incoming co-chair of the Federal Demonstration Partnership. So sadly, this will be my last stint as a co-chair for contracts, and I'm going to miss all of you, but I'm looking forward to my work with FDP.
And Martha?
Hi, I'm Martha Davis, and I am an associate director at Brandeis University, and I co-chair the DTUA working group with Melissa, and I also participate in the communications group as well.
Right, if we'd have the next slide, please. So we're going to try to talk through a whole bunch of fun contract and information security related topics today. Trying to go for enough information to set the stage, and then really have some conversation afterwards on how FDP might be able to help our member organizations reduce the burden of compliance or navigate through some of these new requirements. We're going to touch on the prohibition on certain telecommunications and video surveillance services or equipment. That's coming out of the FY 2019 NDAA and is recently being implemented in uniform guidance and FAR clauses. There's so much fun with the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC. Just a very brief update on the CUI FAR case, which has been pending for quite some time, but looks like it might be moving forward soon. And then we'll provide a few updates regarding the Data Transfer and Use Agreement Working Group. Hopefully you all are part of the contracts and or data stewardship listservs, and will have received the email yesterday letting everyone know that the new reciprocal DTUA template and the new collaborative DTUA sample have been posted to the website. If you aren't on the listserv, have no fear. You can just go to either the data stewardship or the contracts website, our page of the FDP website, the fdp.org, and find those documents for your reference. It's also easy peasy to join the listservs. There's a little link on the FDP website. I think it's up at the top near the sort of the right-hand side of the page, where you can click on that and join all the wonderful listservs, especially for those folks that might be joining us from new member organizations. And then we'll close with a discussion of some upcoming volunteer opportunities, and discussion of other projects that we might want either contracts or data stewardship or the DTUA working group to take on. Next slide, please. All right, Alex.
Okay, this is a current hot topic. I think not something that most of us are enjoying, but something that we're all dealing with currently. So I thought, just a few slides We're available for questions afterwards, so I'm going to move through quickly, but of course, you can send your questions in chat and we'll get to them as much as we can. And if we can't answer, we will follow up after this session to answer your questions. So the National Defense Authorization Act is passed each year, and the NDAA from fiscal year 19, there was a section 889 that is affecting us both from a contract and a grant perspective. I recognize this is a contract session, but I'm going to speak briefly about the grants as well. And these terms became effective as of August 13th, but we're now just seeing the implementation. Just a little bit of background, that statutory provisions that you see in section 889, as I mentioned, they affect both contracts and grants through the FAR, and those are the relevant clauses. 52-204, 24 are the standard reps and certs, 25 are the contract clause, and 26 are some additional definitions. And then separately, there's a new prohibition on the use of grant funds that have been included in the updated uniform guidance that was just released. Next slide. So in the FAR, there's two provisions that provide restrictions that we're now dealing with and trying to figure out how we're going to deal with it. The first section, 52-204-25B1, is specifically focused on the federal government may not procure from a contractor equipment, services, or systems that use covered technology as a substantial essential component. So the covered technology, I did not include a slide, but if you go in and actually read the clause, covered technology is essentially certain telecommunications and video surveillance equipment, and specifically that has been manufactured by certain Chinese companies. Huawei, ZTE are two examples, and their affiliates. Now this section really isn't exactly new. The previous NDAA did have restrictions on procuring from those two companies, but this has been broadened with the sweeping in many of their affiliates and putting some onus on the contractor to ensure that the affiliates aren't somehow wholly owned or subsidiaries of those companies. The more problematic and newer part is the section B2, where it indicates that the federal government cannot enter into a contract with a contractor that uses any of the equipment, systems, or services as a substantial and essential component. And this is regardless of whether the use is in performance of the federal contract. So what this is telling us is that if we have video cameras on site or certain things that we're not sure would be considered substantial or essential component based on our interpretations, but if you think they could be, such as a router, cell phones, people are questioning that, you cannot use that across the board. So you can't sign off on that contract if you have any of those covered systems or that covered technology in use within your organization. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for you? What it means is that prior to executing a contract that includes these FAR clauses, and we've seen, we have a handful, more than a handful, we have a dozen or so contracts modifications. It even covers no cost extensions. They're adding these clauses. You cannot execute that contract without conducting what they call a reasonable inquiry, which isn't defined, but whatever a reasonable person would think needs to be done in order to inquire about whether or not you have such covered telecommunications services or products or video surveillance equipment. Now, the one good thing is that the FAR requirements are limited to prime contractors, and it specifically does not apply to subcontractors. And they're moving from the certification that I mentioned in 204.24 to having a broad certification within SAM. Now, Hopkins, we did find a new clause in SAM we had to renew by the end of this month, but the current clause is specifically covering B1, not B2, but we will be seeing a broader certification within SAM. The next slide, please. So while this is contracts, I did want to bring up the fact that the NDA does apply to grants, but in a somewhat a better but different way. And so section 200.216 of the Uniform Guidance prohibits non-federal entities from obligating or expending loan or grant funds to procure, extend a contract, or to enter into a contract to procure or obtain such covered telecommunications equipment or services if it's a substantial or essential component of the system or critical technology. This, in fact, applies to both domestic and foreign recipients. And on the face of it, it's not a huge issue because most universities can add in their accounting system certain categories that are not allowable and can't be charged to federal awards, similar to other unallowable expenses on your grants. But there's actually an issue with the drafting, and I just wanted to bring this up, that COGR has actually, next slide please, picked up on that there seems to be conflicting language in the Uniform Guidance. In the introductory section 2A of the Uniform Guidance, it actually does state that federal award recipients cannot use funds to enter into contracts with entities that use covered technologies, equipment, or services. Which contradicts the actual clause 216. So yesterday, COGR sent a letter and did ask that the Uniform Guidance be revised so that that prohibition matches the actual intention of the National Defense Authorization Act, because it appears to conflict. And I just wanted to issue a warning to everyone listening, because there are grants from some federal agencies that institutions are receiving that have that misinterpreted use language. So keep an eye out for that. Please bring it to COGR's attention. I can put you in touch if needed. But hopefully that misinterpretation, as it seems to be inconsistent with the NDAA, will be fixed. Melissa?
All right.
Next
Will
slide.
you do the next slide?
Yes. So we're going to do a poll.
Yeah. So we wanted to just do a quick poll to just gauge where everyone feels like they are right now in their planning or their implementation of a compliance plan.
So has your institution conducted a reasonable inquiry and implemented a plan for compliance with these FAR clauses?
We'll give it just a little bit longer here for folks to finish answering, but initial results show that there are a good number of you all that have conducted their reasonable inquiry and implemented a plan. And so share, please. We have go ahead and share the results. So it looks like most of our respondents, or I guess the highest percentage of respondents, are just beginning the planning to conduct the reasonable inquiry or implementing a plan. A pretty good number, the next is that institutions have conducted their reasonable inquiry and feel pretty good about their compliance plan. And others are in various stages. I think it's this one, we haven't received any contracts or grants that include the clause. That's really important, I think, because in some cases when you're actually presented with an award that requires you to deal with compliance, that might be what you need to get buy-in from your institution to work on a plan. All right, so we do have one volunteer who offered to just sort of share her experiences. Andrea, if you wanted to chime in on kind of what you've seen with this at UCSD.
Is it Andrea Lupo or Andrea Marshall?
Andrea Lupu.
She has to be unmuted.
Yeah,
I think we're good.
okay.
Thanks. Yeah, so we actually did a full inventory a ways back. I think our export control office is usually pretty proactive about highlighting these sorts of issues for IT and contracts and grants. And so we received a contract modification that had the new clause, and they had already been working on this. And so at that point, the first time we saw the clause, we just had to confirm with our institution's cybersecurity officer and export control officer that all of the systems and equipment and pieces of lab equipment that that came from the covered entities had been removed from the university. So I was thankfully not involved in the scramble to get that done, but from the contracting side, I was really appreciative of the IT cybersecurity export side of the house really being on top of this. It was a relief, and it allowed us to execute stuff that was time sensitive without much of a delay.
That's great, and I think from our perspective, particularly, the institutions that are struggling with this the most are the ones that have significant presence overseas. So for instance, in some countries in Africa, some of the sole internet providers in that region rely completely on Huawei infrastructure. So we're struggling trying to figure out, okay, well, what does this mean for our field offices, and when would we be granted an exception if that's the sole operator within that country? So I think there's a lot more to sort out during our reasonable inquiry. I think we have a question. Somebody asked, for practical purposes, if an organization has federal contracts including the prohibition on use of covered technology, does it matter that the uniform guidance does not prohibit usage of the covered tech? No. So if you have contracts, it's essentially saying you can't have that covered tech, you can't use that covered technology. So it's a separate restriction apart from the uniform guidance. So I think of uniform guidance, again, is more of a cost issue and allowability of expenditures versus a use issue.
And the prohibition from the FAR, Alex, is not just on your use of that covered tech in performance of the contract. It's your use of that covered tech
regardless,
anywhere.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. David, do you want to go ahead and share what you guys are working on at Caltech?
Sure. So I was elected to be in charge of Caltech's efforts, for lack of a better term, because we're not done. We've just started, but we've looked at the contract and the grant aspects. Right now, we're more worried about the contract aspects because we're being asked to certify as we receive increments of funding on contract. We're being asked to certify as of August, I think it was August 13th that it went into effect. And so we immediately started looking around, what do we have? And we've run through the procurement database, we've run through the property database looking for various things. And for example, we found some cameras that our housing people had purchased without asking. From a security perspective, they're outdoor cameras that have been placed around housing, around postdoc housing on campus. So they're pretty innocuous. They're not being used in a lab. They're not routing scientific data, but it was a surprise to find these Huawei cameras just sitting there. They'd been purchased 2 or 3 years ago when really nobody really was thinking about this. So, but just identifying them, we're approaching this that we consider ourselves to have performed our reasonable inquiry, but we've decided that the term reasonable is itself in flux, because given the fact that we were being asked to sign a certification on August 15th, 2 days after the requirement went into place, the amount of inquiry we could do that was reasonable to have done in 2 days' time is different than what we consider the reasonable inquiry to be once we have done more pervasive searches through various databases and asking questions and so forth. So we're trying to document in part what reasonable means, and that may change. The definition of a reasonable inquiry for Caltech may change over time as we expand and figure out other ways to actually get at that information. So we didn't consider it a black and white all or nothing, that and we feel we can justify that if we're asked. That's why we're documenting that. There was one other aspect that we were, well, I remember it, I'll pop it up on a chat comment, but there was some other aspect that we'd come up with, but we're still working on it. That's why I marked other on the questionnaire, is because we've done our reasonable inquiry, so we're comfortable certifying to that. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. So it's true that there's no requirement in the FAR clauses to flow this down to subcontractors. However, this is one of those things where we're looking at it as we may want to ask our subcontractors and vendors, not just collaborators, but vendors. We're looking at adding this requirement and flowing it down as part of our general PO terms and conditions, because it applies to every single system, whether federally funded or not. Mm-hmm. It's not just attached to the federal money. So we're thinking, we haven't figured it out in detail yet because we're still discussing it, but we're looking at this as possibly adding it as a standard PO term, pushing the prohibition down, if you will, and putting the obligation on the vendor to inform us whether they can meet this with the products they're supplying us.
So it's something that you would include as part of your PO, regardless of whether or not the funds come from a federal source or not. Right. Yeah, yeah. And I heard two things that were interesting to me out of your comments, David. That this is a particularly difficult inquiry to perform because we're not just worried about our usual research systems. We're worried about everywhere at the university that these tech might be used, and then I think also the importance of documenting how you've defined reasonable. Mm-hmm. So I think that in the event that we're asked, that will be really important for us to be able to define for an auditor or something like that, what definition we used, and then document that we did that. Next slide, please, Lillian. Okay, so by all means, and Jim Luther added into the chat a suggestion to work with Office of Information Technology. They found that theirs had used technology to scan the network for any of the prohibited equipment, which could include video cameras like David mentioned, or a visitor login with a Huawei phone, or et cetera. So that's in addition to working with an export control office or export control officer, making sure that we're really working closely together with our information technology. And Mark Sweet is curious if any institutions are implementing a complete prohibition of purchases going forward. And I don't want to speak for David, but I think that's where it sounded like his institution might be going, or other institutions where we want to be making sure, say we're issuing a vendor agreement for someone to come in and replace those security cameras around the dorms, that they're providing a certification to us that they aren't installing prohibited or covered technologies or covered equipment. But if other folks have thoughts that they want to share, to please go ahead and chime in the chat or raise your hand, and we can unmute you. But you know, given some of the challenges, you know, Alex mentioned the particular challenge of what if you're dealing with a partner in a part of the world where there is no other option, or how do we define reasonable? You know, what are some of the what are some of the ways that your institution has been dealing with these challenges? Or, you know, does anyone have suggestions for things that the FDP could do to be helpful in working through some of these challenges? One of the things that maybe jumped out at me from David's comments was, you know, perhaps we could share our definitions of reasonable, so that we could be learning from each other and kind of crowdsourcing a reasonable definition of reasonable. But we're really interested in hearing from everyone out there. What would be helpful to you, or what suggestions do you have? And Jim has popped into the chat an answer to Mark Sweet's question, and that it is the expectation, if we have federal contracts, that at least domestically, we will both purge our systems of cover technology that we have already, and then also cease those purchases going forward.
Yeah, Jim's raising his hand.
All right. Jim, let me see. Oh.
Hey,
Great.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I don't know that I'm saying anything new. And Alex, you and I talked about this offline. I think, you know, we've had our Office of Information Technology scan all of our networks. And the reasonable inquiry that we're in the midst of is, number one, if the equipment is on the network and we purchased it, then we're replacing it. We had some video cameras that are now gone. The big unknown to us is whether you have visitors to your campus, and we all do, that log into your visitors network. Is that something that, from a risk standpoint, is okay to continue? I think the answer is probably yes. But then the next logical question is, many of us have lots of students, international and otherwise, many of whom come to our institutions with prohibitive equipment. And in many cases, those personally owned devices might log into areas of our network that we then have to evaluate, is that okay? Right? They log into institutional systems. They're not just logging into a visitor's network to get free Wi-Fi because they're in the hospital, but they're logging into our systems and they're downloading apps that we may provide. And then I think that's the one area that we're looking into. And then Alex, the other one is internationally. You know, if we contract for services or lease a building, some space in Africa that uses Huawei equipment, is that a problem or not? And again, from a reasonable inquiry and a risk assessment standpoint, you know, we're having discussions internally and externally about what's reasonable and so forth. So I do think, Alex and Melissa, that there is an opportunity for us to work together to come to similar positions on this, right? Because that have international operations, we probably have employees or subcontractors who are using Huawei equipment because that's what's prevalent in many of those countries. And are we going to say, no, you cannot use that phone to coordinate collection of samples in, wherever. I think we need to evaluate that, and I think FTP could probably help with that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. I think that's a great idea. So David Mayo clarified that Caltech isn't necessarily prohibiting future purchases, but considering a notification requirement so that they would know at least and be able to perform a risk assessment on whether or not they may need to make any positive responses or disclosures. Deborah commented that she's expecting ASU will implement a prohibition of purchasing moving forward. So Alex and I are both taking notes, but it does sound like maybe there's a working group here to kind of perhaps create some best practices or work together on working definitions of the application of reasonable or a reasonable level of inquiry. All right, move on to the next topic. Next slide, Lillian. All right, so, different in that it's related to information security, but sort of in the same space as it relates to the information security, but less on equipment and more on security of systems. So the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, as if we weren't already having enough fun with the DFARS CUI implementation, we're now presented with CMMC, which is an effort that builds upon the existing regulation, but adds a verification component rather than the self-assessment or the self-certification. And I'd like to give a shout out to Jim Kressel. I hope I hope I've said your last name correctly, from University of Washington, who shared some great slides with us that we borrowed for some of this content. But basically the CMMC is based on 5 progressive levels, which is, if we think about, FISMA, where we're familiar with, low, moderate, high, it's a similar principle where at each of the 5 levels, more practices and processes are added on top of the requirements for the lower levels. Next slide. So what we're familiar with the sort of standard CUI requirements is that we can meet those requirements with a self-assessment of our compliance with the NIST standards, and that this self-assessment could be performed after award. It's not a condition of being able to receive the contract. Whereas CMMC certification must be obtained from a third party. And one of the challenges that we're hearing is that there are fewer of such third parties available to help us perform the assessments needed for these certifications than might be necessary to handle the volume of certifications that are now needed. And this third-party certification is required prior to the award. So it's something that would hold up contract execution. And in addition to just focusing on a particular practice for a particular contract, CMMC really focuses on the institutionalization of cybersecurity processes. So it's really looking at the whole system at the institution rather than just the individual information security system that would be used for the contract. Next slide. So hopefully the initial implementation will only exist within the DoD. Other agencies have not yet indicated that they would be implementing a similar requirement. We're expecting to see these requirements added to the RFP. And the RFP should indicate which of the 5 CMMC levels are required for that particular opportunity. And eventually we may see CMMC requirements applying to all DoD funding, including assistance agreements, with complete DoD coverage targeted for fall 2026. And I see that Deborah Murphy from ASU just commented that she's heard there may be an extension on CMMC until October 2021. And depending on what happens on November 3rd, perhaps there could be even further changes there, which would be great. But I haven't heard if that's if there's an official word on that or not. But that would be great. Next slide. Okay, so we wanted to do just another poll to see how institutions are feeling in terms of their institution's plan for compliance. So if, has your institution implemented a plan for compliance?
So while we're taking the poll, one thing that I understand is that it's rolling out in phases. And so it's going to be seen in corporate contracts first. So likely the first ones that we'll start seeing will be from corporate flow downs.
Which always presents us the most fun in contracts, right, Alex? Those corporate subcontracts are just chock full of exciting clauses. All right, looks like we've got over 50% that have chimed in, and most of us are just beginning to develop a compliance plan. So as Alex mentioned, we'll first start to see this in corporate subcontracts. So many of us that don't receive that many of those may be just starting to develop a plan. There are a few institutions that are ready to go, which is, awesome. I hope you share all of your, wisdom gained through the process with the rest of us. And several of us who don't really receive DoD funding, so don't anticipate needing to deal with this unless or until it's rolled out to other agencies.
I'm curious what other, if anybody wants to send a chat or raise their hand, I'd be interested to hear what other means. No, you're not in compliance and you have no plans because you don't care. No, just kidding.
Jim, do you want to go ahead and share what
I don't know
what University of Washington is doing on this? And I hope that I didn't brutalize the content from your slides too much. But anything else you'd want to share with us would be great.
Is it Jim Bradburn that you're looking for?
We see a hand raised.
Kressel, maybe he's not here, or it's not his name.
I don't think I saw anybody under Kressel or Jim.
Okay.
If he can raise his hand, that would be great.
Jim, are you here?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. Andrea, did you want to share what UCSD is working on with this as well? And then there are a couple pleas in the chats that
Yeah.
if anyone who answered, yes, we're ready to go, is willing to reveal themselves and share your wisdom with us, that would be great.
Thanks. So I would not say UCSD is ready to go, but we are working hard on this. There are two main working groups, UCSD campus-wide CMMC group, which I actually am not part of. It's export control, cybersecurity, academics, business officers, other C&G folks, and research administration. And then there's a Scripps Institution of Oceanography CMMC group that I am a part of with similar constituency. Scripps Oceanography, because we conduct classified research, has sort of been the vanguard for CUI issues in general. And our CMMC group actually started as a CUI group. So, we transitioned to this more immediate challenge. One of the main things we've been looking at is sort of the downstream effects and sort of the tentacles of CMMC requirements. A lot of the campus systems are secure, but not necessarily CMMC secure. Contracting databases, for example, our accounting contracts databases are probably not up to the standards they'll need to be for the kinds of contracts we will have if DoD says that contracts are CUI. So, we're trying to figure out all the different places we need to look for how to comply. We're also looking at how to pay for everything and how to justify to the administration that they need to pay for all of this. One of the difficulties has been how to model DoD funding. As we all know, DoD doesn't really issue funding in any sort of schedule or consistent pace, especially for us. A lot of our contracts are multi-year, multi-million-dollar projects with incremental funding that just comes when it's available to the PM. So when our IT folks ask us to try and predict the level of sponsored research that will need to be CMMC compliant so they can go to the administration and say, look, here's the level of research activity that we need to protect and we need to be prepared to maintain by being CMMC compliant. It's really difficult to give them answers for showing how important it is to be able to be CMMC compliant. And related to that, it's a little bit difficult to date to translate which of our existing awards are likely to be the type of awards that will be covered by CMMC. There are like 7 or 8 different ways that current contracts show that there's CUI. It could be that we don't have a fundamental research determination. It could be in a CDRL. It could be because it's a classified contract, but then maybe it's classified with CDRLs that are distribution A. So working with our IT folks on identifying the contracts that they'll use as the base for this modeling has also been challenging. I will say that might be a good thing about CMMC, is that it will provide us with some consistency in how the government communicates the requirements for CUI, which, is not necessarily, doesn't always work out in our favor, but it could help provide us with some more clarity about CMMC requirements at the beginning of a project when we're looking at covering costs, rather than proposing as fundamental research and then scrounging for CUI compliance costs during award negotiation. So those are the main issues we're looking at. Our IT folks are hard at work, main campus, working with Scripps to make sure that we can propose to the projects we need to propose with. But these, every meeting we have is just kind of we go around and around about these issues, and I do feel sometimes that because the CMMC process itself has not advanced as far as it needs to give us clarity on the requirements, we haven't necessarily been able to make too many conclusions about process and where we are. So it's a lot of developing policy in anticipation of what we're going to have to do.
I like how you put a positive spin on it, but I would argue CUI, when it came out, right, through NARA, that was the whole purpose, was it was supposed to put out consistency
Fair
in how we
point.
handle, right? And
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like it's really happened very well. We'll see. I think that's actually a good lead into our next topic. But yeah, I think if anything, it seems like it's actually going to make it more complicated, because then it's, you know, the CUI or a CMMC going to replace what we understood based on the NIST requirements and the NARA publication. So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, I mean, we're still getting contracts from, you know, DARPA that are with stuff labeled FOUO. So, you know, who knows?
Yeah, I think that is one of the great promises of the CUI FAR clause when we finally see it, is that it will be required, but it will be required to accompany an exhibit or an attachment that specifically outlines either that no CUI is involved or sets forth what type of CUI is going to be shared and all the requirements. You know, one day that world will come. And there's a question in the chat from Mark Swee asking about differences in interpretation as to whether or not CMMC can apply lab by lab, or would it have to be a look at all of campus? And I think that is one of the main differences between at least what we've asked for the CUI FAR clause versus CMMC. So Alex, goodness, was it maybe in 2015? It was a few years ago when NARA first started talking about the CUI FAR clause. And, you know, we prepared a white paper on educational institutions' sort of hopes and wishes for the clause. And one of the things we specifically asked for was that we be able to certify or attest compliance for just the system that is accessing the CUI under that contract. And, you know, on its surface, CMMC does appear to be or require certification of broader systems than that. We have a question on whether this would apply to ONR as well. And I think that it will, but initially, as Alex said, just to corporate contracts. So we might see it in corporate subcontracts if you receive ONR FAR-based subcontracts. And Michelle commented that in most cases, it's likely institutions would need compliance solutions for a smaller number of projects, and how we might be able to handle that kind of a solution.
Yeah, I mean, we do that, right, for HIPAA right now. We use RedCap or something we outsource. I know it's a lot more expensive overall, but if it's just for a program or two, that would be a possibility for institutions that don't do a huge amount of restricted or what will be restricted research, right?
Yeah, or something like FedRAMP. You know, for FSMA compliance, we've used FedRAMP, just a cloud-based solution. Okay, if there are any other folks, you know, particularly those who answered that you're ready to go with a solution, who are willing to share their institution's experiences, do you want to go ahead and raise your hand? While folks are contemplating that, Lillian, do you want to go ahead and also share the next slide? So we're also interested in how FDP might be helpful in navigating some of the CMMC challenges. So one of the, you know, big topics on the table at the Finance, Audit, and Costing committee meeting earlier in the week was costs of data storage, and, you know, how can we best budget for those? And this is a very similar issue, and how can you best estimate and build into the contract the cost of compliance, either for the independent audit or bringing the system up to speed and so that it can be certified compliant. or kind of looking at one of the points that Andrea raised in terms of, are we actually getting the information that we're supposed to be getting from a federal contracting officer? And how is that going? Are we seeing that the RFP is actually clearly outlining the requirement, or are we being surprised when a contract comes in and there's a CMMC requirement or level we weren't expecting? So I don't know if anyone has thoughts they'd want to share on ways that FDP might be helpful in this space, or successes from their institution. Oh. So Jamie's made a great recommendation in the chat that it might be helpful if we come up with some best practices for fundamental research institutions. And in particular, given the issues that DoD's implementation of the CUI requirements and CMMC have meant for fundamental research. So when the DFARS clause originally came out, we talked about some of the challenges with, you know, I'm at a medical school. And so if one of my researchers is doing a contract project with the VA, and in order to do that project needs access to medical records from the VA, that's CUI, and suddenly it looks like that's not fundamental research anymore, which seems really strange given, you know, the nature of medical research, perhaps. And so some of the special considerations for FRE institutions. So we could absolutely look to, maybe that's something we can ask Wade about, Alex, in terms of inviting a DoD rep to come to an upcoming session and share, you know, tips or answer frequently asked questions. And some of the particular considerations Andrea's mentioned for administrative staff. So if we need more solutions for administrative staff to be able to be transmitting documents more securely. These are all great ideas. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next topic on the next slide. Really quick update on the CUI FAR case, which feels like it's been pending since basically 2015 when Alex ran that working group to come up with a white paper. And we've finally, we've heard a new estimated comment period. So hopefully this actually comes to fruition and the long anticipated clause finally comes into being. The new estimated comment period is to be October sometime to December sometime, a 60-day comment period. And FDP is not in the practice of submitting comments when there are these opportunities. We usually rely on our COGR colleagues to submit comments. But we're interested in other ways that member organizations are interested in engaging, either, you know, scheduling calls to discuss, you know, the perspectives everyone is thinking about in terms of the comments your institution might submit to that opportunity, or other ways that FGP can help our member organizations feel prepared for compliance. So again, if anyone has anything they wanted to add, go ahead and add that to the chat or raise your hand. Or just generally anything else that anyone wanted to share on these topics, because I think next we're going to move on to the DTUA, though we will have an opportunity, I think, at the end of the session for more discussion. Okay. I don't see any raised hands or more chat. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So in our last virtual session during the May virtual meeting, we talked a lot about the unique needs of supporting our researchers with an increased volume of requests for data for research related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And related to that, we shared a sample DTUA intake checklist. There's probably more work we could do on guidance in that intake checklist space, but this was something that folks in the DTUA working group felt might be really helpful for researchers that were just working hard to get all the things that they needed to get done and you know, get their project going to try to have some positive impact on the pandemic. Or, you know, clinical researchers who spent all day in the clinic and at the end of the day when they were trying to, you know, get a research project going, just, you know, didn't have it in them to keep track of all of the compliance pieces they needed to cover. So that COVID-19 DTUA sample that we prepared and the sample checklist have both been posted to both the contracts and the data stewardship pages of the FTP website. And I believe, I hope the links in the slide should also work to take you to those documents. And then also most recently, we had shared a, you know, it was a while ago, probably, you know, maybe about a year, a collaborative DTUA template version for comment. And we have created actually 2 documents out of that, a reciprocal DTUA template, which is designed for use by 2 parties, and a collaborative DTUA sample, which is for multiple parties. Like I said in the beginning of the session, hopefully everyone is on the contracts and/or data stewardship listserv and received the email yesterday letting everyone know that those have been posted. But if not, they're available for anyone to access off of the FTP website. So Lillian, if we want to do the next slide and go ahead and move to the PDF document. After you say FTP, FTP, FTP a certain number of times, saying PDF is like a tongue twister. Okay. So Martha, do you want to share a couple comments on why we decided to create 2 documents instead of the one that we'd circulated for comment?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. So the nature of the data going back and forth between, or transferring between 2 parties and multiple parties, the working group found that there were certain areas that, certain clauses that would change. And so that's basically why we did 2 versions. One is a template and the other is a sample. And the reason the collaborative DTUA is a sample is there's certain things that we were unable to standardize because it really depended on the certain issues that come up in a collaborative situation, like termination, or whether it's going to be everybody's publishing together or separately. And so we decided that the sample might need to be modified. We have put into it certain language that you could use under certain assumptions, but those may not be correct. And but we were able to do the reciprocal DTUA so that it could be standardized.
Thanks, Martha. Yeah, and so you'll see that because the reciprocal DTUA is considered a template, it has been published in a PDF fillable form format. So we do ask that where the text isn't part of a fillable text box, that you please not make changes to that text. Of course, if you do decide to leverage this template as a starting point and make modifications, that is okay. Just please do remember to remove the FDP moniker since it isn't the published FDP format anymore. So just to go through a couple of features of this new version, you'll note that, in the initial published DTUA, there were references to the provider and the recipient. And in this case, because both parties may be providing and/or receiving data, we've gone with party 1 and party 2. So there's places here to put information on who those parties are. And then we recognize that the two parties may be sharing data of different types. So it's very possible that you're doing a project between a collaborative project between a non-covered entity and a HIPAA covered entity, and one is sharing, de-identified data and the other is sharing a limited data set. So there's two separate drop-down menus here to indicate the data type that each is sharing. We've also received some feedback on the agreement term, whereas we had in the original template indicated that the end date would be ideally a certain number of years after the start date, that it's actually far more useful to be able to insert a specific end date. And so we've made that modification. By and large, the majority of the terms are the same, except, we've said here in the beginning that each party is a providing party when providing data and a receiving party when receiving data. So the terminology is a little bit different. It's providing party instead of provider, but the flow of this bi-directional sharing of data, it made a little bit more sense to use those terms. But then we, for the most part, tried to keep the rest of the language largely the same. A couple of the distinctive differences are here in the publication language. So one of the challenges that we had heard about in terms of the initial DTUA is that it didn't contemplate collaborative publications. And institutions really, even if only one party was sharing data, they really felt the need to be able to reflect that publications might be collaborative. And so this does contemplate that. For that reason, this template could also be used in the event that there are collaborative publications contemplated. Oh, and I already see I need to perhaps update this drop-down menu. So it's entirely possible that there's collaborative publications, but still only one party providing data. And so you could use this template, but indicate in the drop-down menu or in the description of the data, none. So I'll make sure that I make that correction. In addition to, sorry, I went a little too fast here. In addition to that change to the publication language, we also made a modification to the liability language here. And this was because we received some feedback that it felt to some institutions like the liability language we had utilized in the previous version was left the receiving party open to liability to be introduced by the providing party. Because, if the providing party was violating applicable privacy or security laws and providing the data to us in the first place, feeling the need to make sure that the receiving party wasn't taking on liability for that. And so we have modified the liability language in this template, but this is not a change that would be exclusive to this template. We are planning to go back to the unidirectional template, and the next time we update that, we will also make the same change in the liability language. Some other changes, this is mostly, again, a terminology change where we received feedback that referring to collaborators in attachment 3 was confusing. And so we have changed that terminology to refer to permitted third parties. And there are some changes in attachment 1 structure here, where we are assuming that this is still for one project. And so there's one description of the project, but that there might need to be different descriptions of the data or disposition requirements based on the party. So text boxes here to include the description of party 1 data. And this is where, you could say none in this section if you're using this to leverage the collaborative publication language. But not both parties are providing data. You can just indicate none. And here are the disposition requirements and the contact for data transfer for party 1, and then similarly the same information for party 2. We've also removed reference to potential reimbursement for costs of the data transfer, again, because the implication here is that this is a more collaborative project and there might be this bidirectional transfer of data. It seemed less applicable to this scenario, so it was removed. And then, Martha, do you want to say a couple words about a reminder for attachment 2?
Yeah, so it's important to include attachment 2 with both the template and the sample, because it's important that each party understands the information being transferred and that it's clear, and including the information that you mentioned, such as if there's a data dictionary or the format of the data, if it's human subjects, animal subjects, that needs to be included. And in addition, the attachment 2s need to be included so that it's applicable to the data that's being transferred.
Absolutely. So we have not gotten as fancy with our programming for the DTUA templates yet as the subwords group. Those templates have been in use for far longer, and the language can be considered far more stable. So we're the low-tech PDF fillable form version where we have included the face pages, attachment 1 and attachment 3 in this fillable PDF form. But you do still, if you're selecting here the de-identified data about human subjects, please make sure to include that version of attachment 2. And similarly, if the 2 parties are sharing the same data type, it's just one attachment 2. But if party 1 is sharing de-identified data and party 2 is sharing a limited data set, please make sure here between attachment 1 and attachment 3 to go ahead and add in the both of the applicable versions of attachment 2. And then aside from the small update in terminology, attachment 3 remains unchanged, where you have the option to say that no collaborators are permitted on the project, or to authorize a subcontractor, for example, to gain access to the data from one of the parties and provide the desired definition in the text box. We have provided a sample definition, but users of the template are welcome to make tweaks to this definition as necessary to meet their needs. All right, Lillian, if we could move to the collaborative sample Word document, please. Great, thank you, Lillian. So you'll see here up at the top, well, the sample has been posted as a Word document to facilitate making the tweaks or the updates to the terms that are necessary to meet project-specific requirements. And we've included in big red text up here, a reminder that all of our big bold red text is instructions to the drafter. So please remove that prior to completing the document for execution. And a note that this is a sample, and so it can be revised to meet project-specific needs. The formatting on this needs to be a little bit different because it's designed to be more than 2 parties, but as many as are necessary for the project that you're working on. And so it would be very difficult to provide all of the information in a chart form up at the top here. So we've just limited this now to the project title and the agreement term, and then indicated that all parties who will execute a signature page and become a party to the agreement should be named here. Many of the terms here are going to be very similar in nature to what we've utilized in the reciprocal DTUA, just referring to more than 2 parties rather than the 2-party language that could be used in the reciprocal DTUA. We also note here in the publication language that it is possible that you're using this template because you have a need for a multi-party agreement, but may not necessarily be contemplating collaborative publications. And so in the event that that's the case, this language assumes that a multi-party data sharing arrangement would result in collaborative publications, but if not, this section can be modified accordingly. And then here in the termination language is really where, Martha mentioned that it would be really hard for us to prescribe terms that would work in every scenario. And I think that was very much so the case in large part with the termination language, because it's easier in a 2-party arrangement to say 1 party terminates and the agreement is done. Whereas when you have multi-party agreements, it can get very complicated. If 1 party needs to terminate, their investigator leaves, or they're just not able to continue participating in the project. So it's a sort of a termination for convenience kind of scenario. What happens? How do the other parties have to destroy the data that they receive from that party? How can the project keep going without them? But then also what happens, so that's, we tried to describe how that could be treated in little a here. And then in little b, but what happens if one of the parties to the agreement breaches the agreement? And so now 1 or more of the parties don't feel comfortable continuing an agreement with that breaching party and want to exit the agreement. What happens then? And we felt that probably would lead to the end of the agreement and a requirement for the breaching party perhaps to promptly return or destroy the data. And then perhaps the parties that wanted to continue the project would enter into a new DTUA that would permit their continued use of the data and a clean start. But we recognize that this isn't going to work for every project. If data is being linked and it's not possible to, pull 1 party's data set out of the linked data set, or the parties really need the project to keep going, even if 1 party decides that they can't continue in the collaboration. This is one of those sections where we felt that this was going to need to be modified to meet the specific needs of the project. And so we wanted to publish this as a sample to facilitate that.
And Melissa?
Sorry. Yep.
And so there really needs to be a discussion at the beginning before these are sent out as to what will happen in the case of a termination in the various scenarios.
Yes, that's right. Yes, far more discussion in terms of what the parties need to see before you get to execution, and actually probably some negotiation potentially. Whereas we're hoping that the templates will be utilized as they are, there's recognition that this might require a little bit of negotiation because they are more complex arrangements. Thank you for that, Martha. Again, because this is multi-party, we had to approach the signatures a little bit differently. So there is a signature page for each party. And our vision here is that you'd include the project title up at the top of the page so that everybody knows what signature page, what agreement this signature page belongs with. Insert, the name of the party, relevant information related to the data that's being provided by that party, any special disposition or other special instructions that are coming from that party. And this is structured as 2 pages, but if the text boxes on that first page are really short and it all fits on 1 page, I think that's great. But we wanted to provide the space in case more space to add text was needed. And then also the contact information for the scientists for that party, where data should be sent, contact information for formal notices, that's all appears on that signature page. So we tried to make sure that all information that would relate to a party was appearing on the signature page for that party. And then attachment 1 relates to project information. So this is where we would indicate the project that's being undertaken by the parties, because again, there's an assumption that we're doing this in one agreement because all of the parties are working on a similar project. And then in the event that there is public access requirements, so if you're leveraging this sample for a data coordinating center type of agreement, and you've got one of the parties is acting as that data coordinating center, but everyone is receiving an NIH award to support their participation in the project, you might reference the NIH public access requirements here. And then in this case, because it's a Word document, we have inserted a placeholder page as a reminder to make sure to go ahead and pull all of the relevant versions of attachment 2 that apply to the data being shared under the agreement. And then attachment 3 in this sample is very similar to attachment 3 in the other templates in providing a place to indicate whether any third-party personnel are permitted to access and use the data. Where this is a multi-party agreement, it seems unlikely that an option like this might need to be leveraged, but we couldn't totally confirm for ourselves that it would never happen. And so we wanted to provide the option in the event that there was a circumstance that warranted it. But again, if this is really something that doesn't make sense for the multi-party arrangement that you're entering into, the sample could be modified to remove this. All right. Lillian, if we want to go ahead and go back to the slides, and I don't know if there's any questions or comments anyone has that they'd like to share on the new DTUA components that have been published. I have seen at least a couple of our other working group participants. I think I saw Diana Boglin. She's been a great participant, and I was looking for others. Big shout out to that working group for all of their hard work in getting these documents posted. We hope they'll be very useful for everyone. Okay, great. If anyone has any suggestions for things that they'd like to see us take on for the DTUA working group, I think our next step from here will be to update the the guidance that was posted, the FAQs, to reflect the new components that are available. And the sample intake checklist was also something that we received a lot of comments on in the pilot. So we might look back to that and try to refine it. But we welcome any suggestions from anyone who has a big pain point in processing DTUAs at their institution and has a suggestion for a way that we might be able to help out. All right. And I love you too, Diana. It has been a great experience working on the group. All right, so Lillian, if we could have the next slide. All right, so Alex, I don't know if you want to say a word or two about any of the volunteer opportunities that might be coming up, because we've got contracts, co-shares that are going off to bigger pastures to lead the whole shebang.
Right. So first, thanks to everybody, and especially not just our continuing members, but our new members. Reach out if you have any questions. As Melissa said, there's a lot of information on our website. There's a tab that you can click on and see all the different listservs. So please go ahead and make sure that you sign up on any of the listservs that you might be interested in receiving information on. I've been a co-chair for contracts for much longer than I care to admit. Even when I became co-chair of research compliance, I just could not give up contracts. So it's been something that I've loved for years, but I think as I'm the administrative co-chair for FDP, I'm going to have to step down. So we've had a lot of great participation over the years in different working groups, different areas of people's interest. And so if anybody, you or anybody you know, that's been maybe active in a work group or a subcommittee or just interested in very active in current contracting events, please reach out if you're interested in becoming a co-chair. And as an FDP as a whole, we're going to be working on how we can broaden volunteerism and participation. So even if contracts is not, you're here because you're curious and you want to learn a little bit, but you wouldn't regard yourself as an expert in the area, there's going to be a lot of other opportunities. And in fact, we're going to try to pull together a nominating committee, just an ad hoc committee that's going to go out and try to find people and place them on committees, and both in leadership positions and then just participation. So stay tuned. And I think this is our last session of this FDP. So I want to thank everybody for participating. I think it was a excellent participation, excellent sessions. And Lillian, I just have to say, you've just been amazing. I don't know, you probably haven't slept in a week, and I just want to thank you personally for all the hard work in getting this together. So thanks, everybody.